Section 6. The Story of Atlantis by William Scott-Elliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Atlantis, Part 6.
Manners and Customs. There was doubtless as much variety in the manners and customs of the Atlanteans at different epochs of their history as there has been among the various nations which compose our Aryan race. With the fluctuating fashion of the centuries we are not concerned. The following remarks will attempt to deal merely with the leading characteristics which differentiate their habits from our own, and these will be chosen as much as possible from the great Toltec era. With regard to marriage and the relations of the sexes, the experiments made by the Turanians have already been referred to. Polygamous customs were prevalent at different times among all the sub-races, but in the Toltec days, while 2 wives were allowed by the law, great numbers of men had only 1 wife. Nor were the women, as in countries nowadays where polygamy prevails, regarded as inferiors, or in the least oppressed. Their position was quite equal to that of the men, while the aptitude many of them displayed in acquiring the vril power made them fully the equals, if not the superiors, of the other sex. This equality indeed was recognized from infancy, and there was no separation of the sexes in schools or colleges. Boys and girls were taught together. It was the rule too, and not the exception, for complete harmony to prevail in the dual households, and the mothers taught their children to look equally to their fathers' wives for love and protection. Nor were women debarred from taking part in the government. Sometimes they were members of the councils, and occasionally even were chosen by the adept emperor to represent him in the various provinces as the local sovereigns. The writing material of the Atlanteans consisted of thin sheets of metal, on the white porcelain-like surface of which the words were written. They also had the means of reproducing the written text by placing on the inscribed sheet another thin metal plate, which had previously been dipped in some liquid. The text thus graven on the second plate could be reproduced at will on other sheets, a great number of which, fastened together, constituted a book. A custom which differs considerably from our own must be instanced next, in their choice of food. It is an unpleasant subject, but can scarcely be passed over. The flesh of the animals they usually discarded, while the parts which among us are avoided as food were by them devoured. The blood also they drank, often hot from the animal, and various cooked dishes were also made of it. It must not, however, be thought that they were without the lighter, and to us more palatable, kinds of food. The seas and rivers provided them with fish, the flesh of which they ate, though often in such an advanced stage of decomposition as would be to us revolting. The different grains were largely cultivated, of which were made bread and cakes. They also had milk, fruit, and vegetables. A small minority of the inhabitants, it is true, never adopted the revolting customs above referred to. This was the case with the adept kings and emperors and the initiated priesthood throughout the whole empire. They were entirely vegetarian in their habits, but though many of the emperor's councillors and the officials about the court affected to prefer the purer diet, they often indulged in secret their grosser tastes. Nor were strong drinks unknown in those days. Fermented liquor of a very potent sort was at one time much in vogue, but it was so apt to make those who drank it dangerously excited that a law was passed absolutely forbidding its consumption. The weapons of warfare and the chase differed considerably at different epochs. Swords and spears, bows and arrows, sufficed as a rule for the Rmoahals and the Tlavatli. The beasts which they hunted at that very early period were mammoths with long woolly hair, elephants, and hippopotami. Marsupials also abounded, as well as survivals of intermediate types, some being half reptile and half mammal, others half reptile and half bird. The use of explosive was adopted at an early period, and carried to great perfection in later times. Some appear to have been made to explode on concussion, others after a certain interval of time, but in either case the destruction to life seems to have resulted from the release of some poisonous vapour, not from the impact of bullets. So powerful indeed must have become these explosives in later Atlantean times, that we hear of whole companies of men being destroyed in battle by the noxious gas generated by the explosion of one of these bombs above their heads, thrown there by some sort of lever. The monetary system must now be considered. During the first 3 sub-races at all events, Such a thing as a state coinage was unknown. Small pieces of metal or leather, stamped with some given value, were, it is true, used as tokens. Having a perforation in the centre, they were strung together, and were usually carried at the girdle. But each man was, as it were, his own coiner, and the leather or metal token, fabricated by him and exchanged with another for value received, was but a personal acknowledgment of indebtedness, such as a promissory note is among us. No man was entitled to fabricate more of these tokens than he was able to redeem by the transfer of goods in his possession. The tokens did not circulate as coinage does, while the holder of the token had the means to estimate with perfect accuracy the resources of his debtor by the clairvoyant faculty which all then possessed to a greater or less degree, and which, in any case of doubt, was instantly directed to ascertain the actual state of the facts. It must be stated, however, that in the later days of Poseidonis a system approximating to our own currency was adopted, and the triple mountain visible from the great southern capital was the favourite representation of the state coinage. But the system of land tenure is the most important subject under this heading. Among the Rmoahal and Tlavatli, who lived chiefly by hunting and fishing, the question naturally did not arise, though some system of village cultivation was recognized in the Tlavatli days. It was with the increase of population and civilization in the early Toltec times that land first became worth fighting for. It is not proposed to trace the system or want of system prevalent in the troublous times anterior to the advent of the Golden Age, but the records of that epoch present to the consideration not only of political economists, but of all who regard the welfare of the race, a subject of the utmost interest and importance. The population, it must be remembered, had been steadily increasing, and under the government of the adept emperors it had reached the very large figure already quoted. Nevertheless, poverty and want were things undreamt of in those days, and this social well-being was no doubt partly due to the system of land tenure. Not only was all the land and its produce regarded as belonging to the emperor, but all the flocks and herds upon it were his as well. The country was divided into different provinces or districts, each province having at its head one of the subsidiary kings or viceroys appointed by the emperor. Each of these viceroys was held responsible for the government and well-being of all the inhabitants under his rule. The tillage of the land, the harvesting of the crops, and the pasturage of the herbs lay within his sphere of superintendence, as well as the conducting of such agricultural experiments as have been already referred to. Each viceroy had round him a council of agricultural advisers and coadjutors, who had amongst their other duties to be well versed in astronomy, for it was not a barren science in those days. The occult influences on plant and animal life were then studied and taken advantage of. The power, too, of producing rain at will was not uncommon then, while the effects of a glacial epoch were on more than one occasion partly neutralized in the northern parts of the continent by occult science. The right day for beginning every agricultural operation was of course duly calculated, and the work carried into effect by the officials whose duty it was to supervise every detail. The produce raised in each district or kingdom was, as a rule, consumed in it, but an exchange of agricultural commodities was sometimes arranged between the rulers. After a small share had been put aside for the emperor and the central government at the city of the Golden Gates, the produce of the whole district or kingdom was divided among the inhabitants, the local viceroy and his retinue of officials naturally receiving the larger portions, but the meanest agricultural labourer getting enough to secure him competence and comfort. Any increase in the productive capacity of the land, or in the mineral wealth which it yielded, was divided proportionately amongst all concerned. All, therefore, were interested in making the result of their combined labour as lucrative as possible. This system worked admirably for a very long period, but as time went on, negligence and self-seeking crept in. Those whose duty it was to superintend threw more and more responsibility on their inferiors in office, and in time it became rare for the rulers to interfere or to interest themselves in any of the operations. This was the beginning of the evil days. The members of the dominant class, who had previously given all their time to the state duties, began to think about making their own lives more pleasant. The elaboration of luxury was setting in. There was one cause in particular which produced great discontent amongst the lower classes. The system under which the youth of the nation was drafted into the technical schools has already been referred to. Now, it was always one of the superior class, whose psychic faculties had been duly cultivated, to whom the duty was assigned of selecting the children so that each one should receive the training and ultimately be devoted to the occupation for which he was naturally most fitted. But when those possessed of the clairvoyant vision, by which alone such choice could be made, delegated their duties to inferiors who were wanting in such psychic attributes, the results ensuing were that the children were often thrust into wrong grooves, and those whose capacity and taste lay in one direction often found themselves tied for life to an occupation which they disliked, and in which, therefore, they were rarely successful. The systems of land tenure, which ensued in different parts of the empire on the breaking up of the great Toltec dynasty, were many and various. But it is not necessary to follow them. In the later days of Poseidonis they had, as a rule, given place to the system of individual ownership, which we know so well. Reference has already been made, under the head of emigrations, to the system of land tenure which prevailed during that glorious period of Peruvian history when the Incans held sway, about 14,000 years ago. A short summary of this may be of interest, as demonstrating the source from which its groundwork was doubtless derived, as well as instancing the variations which had been adopted in this somewhat more complicated system. All title to land was derived in the first instance from the Inca, but half of it was assigned to the cultivators, who, of course, constituted the great bulk of the population. The other half was divided between the Inca and the priesthood, who celebrated the worship of the sun. Out of the proceeds of his specially allotted lands, the Inca had to keep up the army, the roads throughout the whole empire, and all the machinery of government. This was conducted by a special governing class, all more or less closely related to the Inca himself, and representing a civilization and a culture much in advance of the great masses of the population. The remaining fourth, the lands of the sun, provided not only for the priests, who conducted the public worship throughout the empire, but for the entire education of the people in schools and colleges, for all sick and infirm persons, and finally for every inhabitant, exclusive of course of the governing class, for whom there was no cessation of work, on reaching the age of 45, that being the age arranged for the hard work of life to cease, and for leisure and enjoyment to begin. Religion. The only subject that now remains to be dealt with is the evolution of religious ideas. Between the spiritual aspiration of a rude but simple race and the degraded ritual of an intellectually cultured but spiritually dead people lies a gulf which only the term religion, used in its widest acceptation, can span. Nevertheless, it is this consecutive process of generation and degeneration which has to be traced in the history of the Atlantean people. It will be remembered that the government under which the Rmoahals came into existence was described as the most perfect conceivable, for it was the Manu himself who acted as their king. The memory of this divine ruler was naturally preserved in the annals of the race, and in due time he came to be regarded as a god, among a people who were naturally psychic, and had consequently glimpses of those states of consciousness which transcend our ordinary waking condition. Retaining these higher attributes, it was only natural that this primitive people should adopt a religion which, though in no way representative of any exalted philosophy, was of a type far from ignoble. In later days this phase of religious belief passed into a kind of ancestor worship. The Tlavatli, while inheriting the traditional reverence and worship for the Manu, were taught by adept instructors of the existence of a supreme being whose symbol was recognized as the sun. They thus developed a sort of sun worship, for the practice of which they repaired to the hilltops. There they built great circles of upright monoliths. These were intended to be symbolical of the sun's yearly course, but they were also used for astronomical purposes, being placed so that to one standing at the high altar the sun would rise at the winter solstice behind one of these monoliths, at the vernal equinox behind another, and so on throughout the year. Astronomical observations of a still more complex character connected with the more distant constellations were also helped by these stone circles. We have already seen under the head of emigrations how a later sub-race, the Akkadians, in the erection of Stonehenge, reverted to this primitive building of monoliths. Endowed though the Tlavatli were with somewhat greater capacity for intellectual development than the previous sub-race, their cult was still of a very primitive type. With a wider diffusion of knowledge in the days of the Toltecs, and more especially with the establishment later on of an initiated priesthood and an adept emperor, increased opportunities were offered to the people for the attainment of a truer conception of the divine. The few who were ready to take full advantage of the teaching offered, after having been tried and tested, were doubtless admitted into the ranks of the priesthood, which then constituted an immense occult fraternity. With these, however, who had so outstripped the mass of humanity as to be ready to begin the progress of the occult path, we are not here concerned, the religions practised by the inhabitants of Atlantis generally being the subject of our investigation. The power to rise to philosophic heights of thought was of course wanting to the masses of those days, as it is similarly wanting to the great majority of the inhabitants of the world today. The nearest approach which the most gifted teacher could make in attempting to convey any idea of the nameless and all-pervading essence of the cosmos was necessarily imparted in the form of symbols, and the sun, naturally enough, was the first symbol adopted. As in our own days too, the more cultivated and spiritually minded would see through the symbol, and might sometimes rise on the wings of devotion to the Father of our spirits, that motive and centre of our soul's desire, object and refuge of our journey's end, while the grosser multitude would see nothing but the symbol and would worship it, as the carved Madonna or the wooden image of the crucified one is today worshipped throughout Catholic Europe. Sun and fire worship then became the cult for the celebration of which magnificent temples were reared throughout the length and breadth of the continent of Atlantis, but more especially in the great city of the Golden Gates, the temple service being performed by retinues of priests endowed by the state for that purpose. In those early days no image of the deity was permitted. The sun disk was considered the only appropriate emblem of the god-head, and as such was used in every temple, a golden disk being generally placed so as to catch the first rays of the rising sun at the vernal equinox or the summer solstice. An interesting example of the almost unalloyed survival of this worship of the sun disk may be instanced in the Shinto ceremonies of Japan. All other representations of deity is, in this faith, regarded as impious, and even the circular mirror of polished metal is hidden from the vulgar gaze save on ceremonial occasions. Unlike the gorgeous temple decorations of Atlantis, however, the Shinto temples are characterized by an entire absence of decoration, the exquisite finish of the plain woodwork being unrelieved by any carving, paint, or varnish. But the sun disk did not always remain the only permissible emblem of deity. The image of a man, an archetypal man, was in after days placed in the temples and adored as the highest representation of the divine. In some ways this might be considered a reversion to the Rmoahal worship of the Manu. Even then the religion was comparatively pure, and the occult fraternity of the good law, of course, did their utmost to keep alive in the hearts of the people the spiritual life. The evil days, however, were drawing near when no altruistic idea should remain to redeem the race from the abyss of selfishness in which it was destined to be overwhelmed. The decay of the ethical idea was the necessary prelude to the perversion of the spiritual. The hand of every man fought for himself alone, and his knowledge was used for purely selfish ends, till it became an established belief that there was nothing in the universe greater or higher than themselves. Each man was his own law and lord and god, and the very worship of the temples ceased to be the worship of any ideal, but became the mere adoration of man as he was known and seen to be. As is written in the book of Dzyan, "Then the fourth became tall with pride. We are the kings, it was said, we are the gods. They built huge cities. Of rare earths and metals they built, and out of the fires vomited. Out of the white stone of the mountains and of the black stone, they cut their own images in their size and likeness, and worshipped them." Shrines were placed in temples in which the statues of each man, wrought in gold or silver, or carved in stone or wood, was adored by himself. The richer men kept whole trains of priests in their employ for the cult and care of their shrines, and offerings were made to these statues as to gods. The apotheosis of self could go no further. It must be remembered that every true religious idea that has ever entered into the mind of man has been consciously suggested to him by the divine instructors or the initiates of the occult lodges, who throughout all the ages have been the guardians of the divine mysteries and of the facts of the supersensual states of consciousness. Mankind generally has but slowly become capable of assimilating a few of these divine ideas, while the monstrous growths and the hideous distortions to which every religion on earth stands as witness must be traced to man's own lower nature. It would seem indeed that he has not always even been fit to be entrusted with knowledge as to the mere symbols under which were veiled the light of deity, for in the days of the Turanian supremacy some of this knowledge was wrongfully divulged. We have seen how the life and light-giving attributes of the sun were in early times used as the symbol to bring before the minds of the people all that they were capable of conceiving of the great First Cause. But other symbols of far deeper and more real significance were known and guarded within the ranks of the priesthood. One of these was the conception of a Trinity in unity. The Trinities of most sacred significance were never divulged to the people, but the Trinity personifying the cosmic powers of the universe as Creator, Preserver, and Destroyer became publicly known in some irregular manner in the Turanian days. This idea was still further materialized and degraded by the Semites into a strictly anthropomorphic trinity consisting of Father, Mother, and Child. A further and rather terrible development of the Turanian times must still be referred to. With the practice of sorcery, many of the inhabitants had of course become aware of the existence of powerful elementals, creatures who had been called into being, or at least animated by their own powerful wills, which, being directed towards maleficent ends, naturally produced elementals of power and malignity. So degraded had then become man's feelings of reverence and worship that they actually began to adore these semi-conscious creations of their own malignant thought. The ritual with which these beings were worshipped was blood-stained from the very start, and of course every sacrifice offered at their shrines gave vitality and persistence to these vampire-like creations. So much so that even to the present day, in various parts of the world, the elementals formed by the powerful will of these old Atlantean sorcerers still continue to exact their tribute from unoffending village communities. Though inaugurated and widely practiced by the brutal Turanians, this blood-stained ritual seems never to have spread to any extent among the other sub-races, though human sacrifices appear to have been not uncommon among some branches of the Semites. In the great Toltec Empire of Mexico, the sun worship of their forefathers was still the national religion, while the bloodless offerings to their beneficent deity, Quetzalcoatl, consisted merely of flowers and fruit. It was only with the coming of the savage Aztecs that the harmless Mexican ritual was supplemented with the blood of human sacrifices, which drenched the altars of their war god, Huitzilopochtli, and the tearing out of the hearts of the victims on the summit of the Teocalli may be regarded as a direct survival of the elemental worship of their Turanian ancestors in Atlantis. It will be seen then that as in our own days the religious life of the people embraced the most varied forms of belief and worship. From the small minority who aspired to initiation and had touch with the higher spiritual life, who knew that good will towards all men, control of thought and purity of life and action were the necessary preliminaries to the attainment of the highest states of consciousness and the widest realms of vision, innumerable phases led down through the more or less blind worship of cosmic powers or of anthropomorphic gods, to the degraded but most widely extended ritual in which each man adored his own image, and to the blood-stained rites of the elemental worship. It must be remembered throughout that we are dealing with the Atlantean race only, so that any reference would be out of place that bore on the still more degraded fetish worship that even then existed, as it still does, amongst the debased representatives of the Lemurian peoples. All through the centuries, then, the various rituals composed to celebrate these various forms of worship were carried on till the final submergence of Poseidonis, by which time the countless hosts of Atlantean emigrants had already established on foreign lands the various cults of the mother continent. To trace the rise and follow the progress in detail of the archaic religions, which in historic times have blossomed into such diverse and antagonistic forms, would be an undertaking of great difficulty, but the illumination it would throw on matters of transcendent importance may some day induce the attempt. In conclusion, it would be vain to attempt to summarize what is already too much of a summary. Rather, let us hope that the foregoing may lend itself as a text from which may be developed histories of the many offshoots of the various sub-races, histories which may analytically examine political and social developments which have been here touched on in the most fragmentary manner. One word, however, may still be said about that evolution of the race, that progress which all creation, with mankind at its head, is ever destined to achieve, century by century, millennium by millennium, manvantara by manvantara, and kalpa by kalpa. The descent of spirit into matter, those two poles of the one eternal substance, is the process which occupies the first half of every cycle. Now the period we have been contemplating in the foregoing pages, the period during which the Atlantean race was running its course, was the very middle or turning point of this present manvantara. The process of evolution, which in our present fifth race has now set in, the return, that is, of matter into spirit, had in those days revealed itself in but a few isolated individual cases, forerunners of the resurrection of the spirit. But the problem, which all who have given the subject any amount of consideration must have felt to be still awaiting a solution, is the surprising contrast in the attributes of the Atlantean race. Side by side with their brutal passions, their degraded animal propensities, were their psychic faculties, their godlike intuition. Now the solution of this apparently insoluble enigma lies in the fact that the building of the bridge had only then been begun, the bridge of manas, or mind, destined to unite in the perfected individual the upward surging forces of the animal and the downward cycling spirit of the god. The animal kingdom of to-day exhibits a field of nature where the building of that bridge has not yet been begun, and even among mankind in the days of Atlantis the connection was so slight that the spiritual attributes had but little controlling power over the lower animal nature. The touch of mind they had was sufficient to add zest to the gratification of the senses, but was not enough to vitalize the still dormant spiritual faculties, which, in the perfected individual, will have to become the absolute monarch. Our metaphor of the bridge may carry us a little further if we consider it as now in process of construction, but as destined to remain incomplete for mankind in general for untold millenniums. In fact, until humanity has completed another circle of the 7 planets and the great fifth round is half-way through its course. Though it was during the latter half of the third root race and the beginning of the fourth that the Manasaputra descended to endow with mind the bulk of humanity who were still without the spark, yet so feebly burned the light all through the Atlantean days that few could be said to have attained to the powers of abstract thought. On the other hand, the functioning of the mind on concrete things came well within their grasp, and as we have seen, it was in the practical concerns of their everyday life, especially when their psychic faculties were directed towards the same objects, that they achieved such remarkable and stupendous results. It must also be remembered that Kama, the fourth principle, naturally obtained its culminating development in the fourth race. This would account for the depths of animal grossness to which they sank, whilst the approach of the cycle to its nadir inevitably accentuated this downward movement, so that there is little to be surprised at in the gradual loss by the race of the psychic faculties and in its descent to selfishness and materialism. Rather should all this be regarded as part of the great cyclic process in obedience to the eternal law. We have all gone through those evil days, and the experiences we then accumulated go to make up the characters we now possess. But a brighter sun now shines on the Aryan race than that which lit the path of their Atlantean forefathers. less dominated by the passions of the senses, more open to the influence of mind, the men of our race have obtained and are obtaining a firmer grasp of knowledge, a wider range of intellect. This upward arc of the great manvantaric cycle will naturally lead increasing numbers towards the entrance of the occult path, and will lend more and more attraction to the transcendent opportunities it offers for the continued strengthening and purification of the character, strengthening and purification no longer directed by mere spasmodic effort, and continually interrupted by misleading attractions, but guided and guarded at every step by the masters of wisdom, so that the upward climb, when once begun, should no longer be halting and uncertain, but lead direct to the glorious goal. The psychic faculties too, and the godlike intuition, lost for a time, but still the rightful heritage of the race, only await the individual effort of re-attainment to give to the character still deeper insight and more transcendent powers. So shall the ranks of the adept instructors, the masters of wisdom, be ever strengthened and recruited. And even amongst us today there must certainly be some, indistinguishable save by the deathless enthusiasm with which they are animated, who will, before the next root race is established on this planet, stand themselves as masters of wisdom to help the race in its upward progress.
End of section 6.